Marcus preferred the company of deceased monarchs to living men, their lives and deaths neatly catalogued, their motivations dissected and filed away in the archives of history. His flat, a precise arrangement of books, papers, and the faint scent of aged parchment served as his sanctuary. He found solace in the immutable past, a stark contrast to the unpredictable, often illogical present. He was a man of facts, of empirical evidence, his skepticism a finely honed tool against the tide of human folly and superstition. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, an unwelcome intrusion into his quiet rhythm. The envelope, thick and cream-colored, bore a coat of arms he did not recognize, and the return address of a solicitor's office in a coastal town he had never visited. Inheritance. The word felt alien, a misplaced piece in the ordered puzzle of his life. He had no known living relatives, certainly none wealthy enough to bequeath anything beyond a forgotten photograph album. The solicitor, a precise individual with a voice like rustling leaves, spoke of Blackwood Manor, an isolated estate, centuries old, perched on a desolate stretch of coastline. It had been left to him by a distant, previously unknown great-aunt, a woman named Eleanor Vance, whose existence Marcus now had to grudgingly acknowledge. The solicitor's tone, initially professional, acquired a subtle, almost imperceptible shift when discussing the manor's reputation. He spoke of local color, of quaint superstitions, and a certain atmosphere. Marcus dismissed it as the theatrical embellishment of a small-town professional attempting to impress a city dweller. He was a historian, not a participant in ghost stories. The manor, however, presented an intriguing historical puzzle, a tangible link to a past he could now directly examine. His determination to understand its lineage, to peel back the layers of its forgotten story, outweighed any fleeting sense of unease. The drive was long, the landscape gradually shedding its familiar trappings of civilization. Rolling hills gave way to stark, wind-scoured moorland, then to a dramatic, craggy coastline. The road narrowed, eventually becoming a gravel track that snaked precariously along the cliff edge. The air grew colder, thick with the tang of salt and damp earth. A low, bruised sky pressed down, the clouds a uniform gray blanket that seemed to absorb all light. Blackwood Manor emerged from the gloom like a jagged tooth. It was not merely old, it was ancient. Its stone walls a mottled gray, streaked with lichen and the dark veins of persistent damp. Turrets rose unevenly, their slate roofs crumbling in places. No neat lawns, no welcoming path. Just a cobbled drive choked with weeds, leading to a massive iron-studded oak door. The silence was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of gulls and the distant rhythmic roar of the sea against the rocks below. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of decay, of something long stagnant. He felt an inexplicable pressure, a subtle weight on his chest, as if the very atmosphere of the place was pressing in. He located the key hidden beneath a loose stone near the doorframe, as instructed by the solicitor. The lock groaned in protest, a sound like an old man sighing, before yielding with a resounding clunk. A rush of air, stale and frigid, met him, carrying a complex aroma of dust, mildew, and something else. A faint, metallic tang, like old blood, or perhaps just rust. He fumbled for his torch, its beam cutting a hesitant path through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the weak light, illuminated briefly before vanishing again. Tapestries, rotted and faded, clung precariously to the walls. This was a place steeped in history, a tangible artifact. He began a methodical sweep of the ground floor, his historian's curiosity overriding the growing sense of unease. He passed through a formal dining room, its long table shrouded in white sheets, a spectral gathering. Finally, he located what appeared to be a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes bound in leather, many of their spines cracked and faded. A heavy oak desk stood in the center, littered with papers that had long since turned brittle. On the desk, Beneath a layer of dust so thick it resembled fine silt, lay a rolled parchment. He carefully unrolled it. It was an old, hand-drawn map of the Blackwood estate. The lines were precise, depicting fields, woods, and the manor itself. His gaze followed the contours of the land, stretching to the very edge of the paper, where the jagged coastline was meticulously detailed. Reveal discovery. There, marked with a small, almost imperceptible X, and labeled in faded script, were the coastal caves. His eyes traced the coastline, noticing the intricate network of caverns etched into the cliffs. But it was not the caves themselves that halted his breath. Around the depiction of Blackwood Manor on the map, intertwined with its foundations and extending outwards like a parasitic growth, were strange, organic patterns. They weren't architectural blueprints or landscaping designs. They resembled roots, or perhaps veins, spreading beneath the manor, pulsing outwards towards the marked coastal caves and into the very fabric of the paper. As he stared, a subtle shift occurred in the air, a drop in temperature so abrupt it felt like stepping into an invisible pool of ice water. The faint metallic tang intensified, asserting itself over the smell of dust. The patterns on the map remained, undeniable and unsettling, an ancient, cryptic language woven into the very representation of the manor. Marcus regarded the crates, stacked like sarcophagi in the manor's cavernous main hall. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the leaded windows, illuminating the pervasive scent of damp stone and something else. Something ancient and dry, like forgotten spices or long-dead flowers. His flat, with its meticulous order, now felt a world away. Here, chaos reigned, but Marcus was a man who understood the architecture of chaos, a historian who saw patterns in the debris of time. He would impose his own order. He selected a room off the main hall, one with a large, unadorned oak table and a single, grime-streaked window overlooking a desolate stretch of overgrown garden. This would be his study, his intellectual command center. He began by systematically unpacking his research materials. Heavy tomes bound in leather, stacks of brittle microfiche, annotated printouts, and his own meticulously organized note cards. Each box was opened, its contents carefully removed and arranged on the table or on the few existing rickety bookshelves. The process was slow, deliberate, a ritual of establishment. As he sorted through a collection of medieval charters, a sudden, profound chill permeated the air directly behind him. It was not the general damp coolness of an old building, but a focused pocket of cold, sharp enough to raise gooseflesh on his arms. Marcus paused, his fingers hovering over a parchment. He turned slowly, expecting to see an open window, a cracked pane, a gaping hole in the wall. Nothing. The window was latched tight, the heavy velvet drapes drawn partially closed. He frowned, a crease forming between his brows. An old house, he reasoned, would have drafts. Inconsistent heating, perhaps. He shivered, pulling his cardigan tighter, and returned to his work, dismissing the sensation as an architectural peculiarity. Hours later, the room was beginning to resemble a functional workspace. Books were shelved by era, papers stacked by subject. It was like dry leaves skittering across flagstones, or the rustle of old silk. He stopped, holding his breath, straining to hear it again. The manor was silent, save for the creak of settling timbers and the distant sigh of the wind. He listened intently, his head cocked, but there was nothing. A trick of the acoustics, he concluded, or perhaps the wind playing games with the ancient chimney. His mind, accustomed to dissecting historical records, was adept at finding logical explanations for inconvenient anomalies. He continued working, the soft scrape of his pen on paper the only sound for a long while. He had just placed a heavily annotated copy of a local parish register on a newly cleared section of the table, intending to cross-reference some names, when his gaze drifted. The register was no longer there. His eyes scanned the table, then the floor, then the surrounding shelves. He knew, with absolute certainty, where he had placed it. He retraced his steps, mentally reviewing his movements. Had he picked it up again? No. He distinctly remembered setting it down. He sighed, a sound of weary exasperation. Perhaps he was more tired than he thought, his precision faltering under the weight of the move. He spotted it then, not on the table where he'd left it, but on a lower shelf, tucked behind a collection of geological surveys he hadn't even touched yet. It was only a few feet away, a minor displacement, but enough to irk him. He picked it up, a faint sense of unease stirring beneath his carefully constructed composure. His mind, however, immediately supplied the explanation. He must have, in a moment of distraction, placed it there himself. The brain, he knew, often played tricks on memory, especially when fatigued. Later, as the last vestiges of daylight faded, Marcus decided to explore the manor's own archives. The previous owner, a distant relative he barely knew, had been an eccentric collector of local history. Marcus found a small, locked study adjacent to the library, its air thick with the smell of mildew and stagnant air. On a dust-shrouded desk, beneath a pile of brittle tax receipts, he discovered a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth, its pages yellowed and fragile. It was not a formal record, but a personal diary, its script a spidery, hesitant hand. He opened it carefully, the dry paper crackling like autumn leaves. The entries were dated from the mid-19th century. The early pages were mundane, detailing weather, social visits, the price of grain. Then, the tone shifted. August 14th. My wife claims to hear voices faint as the wind, but Marcus dismiss it as nerves. This house, it settles, as all old things do. Marcus read on, a flicker of academic interest overriding his earlier unease. The entries became more frequent, more agitated. September 3rd. The objects, they move. A book, placed on the mantel, later found beneath the chaise. My spectacles, laid on the bedside table, now on the window ledge. Marcus blamed my advanced years, my failing memory. He remembered his own misplaced parish register. He pressed on, his eyes darting across the page. October 12th. Marcus dreamt of the coastal caves last night, of the tide pulling me in, the cold, dark water closing over my head. Marcus woke in a sweat, convinced Marcus was drowning. The house feels tighter. The walls press in. My thoughts are not my own. Marcus felt a prickle on the back of his neck. The struggles of the previous owner were becoming disturbingly familiar. The journal spoke of a growing confusion, a blurring of time, a sense of being watched by an unseen presence within the house itself. The entries grew more fragmented, the handwriting more frantic. November 1st. He spoke of the house, the old groundskeeper, said it lives, said it breathes. Marcus thought him mad. Now, Marcus wonder. My memories. They slip. Names, faces, gone. The house takes them. It feeds. The final entry, scrawled in a barely legible hand, was a desperate plea. It is inside me. Marcus cannot escape. The house consumes. Marcus closed the journal, the dry leather cool against his fingertips. His rational mind immediately sought explanations. Senility, perhaps a progressive neurological disorder, the isolation of the manor exacerbating a fragile mind. He was a historian, not a sentimentalist. He had encountered countless records of mental decline, of individuals succumbing to the pressures of their environments. This was merely another case study, another tragic footnote in the manor's long history. Marcus woke to the precise chime of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound he had, until recently, dismissed as mere mechanical resonance. Now it seemed to vibrate with an unnatural depth, a low hum that lingered long after the final note faded. The previous evening's journal entry, detailing the groundskeeper's descent into paranoia, still clung to the edges of his thoughts. He catalogued it, filed it away under anecdotal evidence of rural isolation and possible senility. Yet a sliver of unease remained, a foreign sensation he found irritating. He moved through the manor's quiet corridors, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. Each groan of the old house, each rustle of air felt amplified. He heard it first as a faint, almost imperceptible murmur, like distant conversation carried on a breeze. He paused, tilting his head. Silence. It was too close, too defined to be the wind. He spun, but the hallway behind him was empty, bathed in the pale morning light filtering through the tall, arched windows. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Fatigue, he concluded. The manor's demanding silence was playing tricks on his senses. That night, sleep offered no respite. He walked through endless, twisting corridors, the walls themselves seeming to press in, their surfaces alive with a shifting, unseen texture. He tried to speak, but his throat was constricted, a silent scream trapped within him. He woke abruptly, gasping, sweat cooling on his skin, the lingering scent of mildew from his dream clinging to his nostrils. He pushed the nightmare from his mind, attributing it to the unsettling journal entry. His rational curiosity, however, had been piqued. The groundskeeper's decline, if not supernatural, was at least a historical anomaly worth investigating. Marcus spent the next several days immersed in the manor's archives. He meticulously sifted through dusty ledgers, bundles of correspondence tied with brittle ribbon and forgotten diaries. He worked in the cavernous study, the scent of old paper and beeswax thick in the air. The sounds of the house were constant companions now. The distant, rhythmic drip of water, the low groan of timbers, and occasionally, that faint, elusive murmur just at the edge of his hearing. He ignored them, focusing on the brittle pages before him. He discovered a pattern. It began subtly, an accumulating weight of evidence that, individually, might be dismissed, but collectively, formed a disturbing tapestry. The first instance was a series of letters from a woman named Eleanor, dated to the late 17th century. Her initial letters were vibrant, full of observations about the manor's beauty. But as the months passed, her tone shifted. Local records indicated he was presumed lost to the sea. Another diary, from a man named Thomas in the mid-18th century, detailed a similar trajectory. He arrived full of ambition, determined to catalog the manor's extensive library. His final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, simply read, "It remembers. It feeds." Thomas was later found dead in the manor's east wing, his body emaciated, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The official cause was listed as consumption, but Marcus noted the unusual speed of his decline. There were others. A young woman in the 19th century who threw herself from the highest tower, leaving behind a note about the suffocating embrace of the house. A reclusive scholar in the early 20th century who slowly starved himself, convinced the manor was stealing his sustenance. Every documented case involved prolonged residence within the manor, often in solitude. Marcus closed the last diary, the dry leather cool against his fingertips. His rational mind struggled to reconcile the recurring elements. Coincidence was a statistical improbability across such a vast timeline. The manor, he thought, was not merely a house. It was a crucible, extracting something vital from its inhabitants. Marcus awoke to the precise chime of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound he had, until recently, dismissed as mere mechanical resonance. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the antique rug cool beneath his bare feet. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach, but he pushed it down. He was a historian, a man of facts, not spectral imaginings. This house, for all its oppressive atmosphere, was merely old. He dressed in the chill morning air, the manor's silence feeling less like peace and more like a held breath. The study, usually a sanctuary of order, now felt like a stage. He pulled out the oldest estate ledgers, their leather bindings cracked, pages brittle with age. He sought patterns, anomalies, anything to explain the peculiar sensations that clung to him like damp mist. He paused, pen hovering. Nothing. Just the wind, perhaps, sifting through the ancient stone. Hours bled into one another. The light outside shifted from weak dawn to a pale, overcast midday. Marcus meticulously cross-referenced entries, his brow furrowed in concentration. He found recurring mentions of lost souls and the deep in marginalia, scribbled in a shaky, almost frantic hand by a former proprietor. Then, a scent, sharp and acrid, filled his nostrils. Salt, brine, and something metallic, unmistakably blood. It was so vivid he gagged, his hand flying to his mouth. He scanned the room, but the scent vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the musty aroma of old paper. He shook his head, pressing his palms against his temples. Fatigue, he told himself. The isolation was getting to him. But then, it happened. This was no trick of the light, no auditory hallucination. This was a memory, raw and visceral, played out before his inner eye. The house wasn't just old. It was a vast, ancient repository of suffering, and he was being forced to witness its archives. He stood, trembling, the fallen chair a testament to his shattered composure. The air in the study felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. He felt it not just behind him, but all around him. A pervasive awareness that judged his every move, weighed his every thought. It was as if the very mortar between the stones hummed with a malevolent sentience, tightening its grip, slowly absorbing him into its desolate narrative. Driven by a desperate need to understand, to rationalize, he remembered a cryptic entry from an earlier journal. The passage to the deep, where the sea claims its own. He had initially dismissed it as local folklore. The image of the drowning woman, the scent of the brine, now urged him forward. He grabbed a heavy antique lantern from the hall, its brass dulled by centuries of neglect. The faint light it cast barely pierced the manor's encroaching gloom. The stone steps were slick with damp. In a forgotten corner, behind a stack of rotted wine casks, he found it. A low, arched doorway, almost entirely obscured by thick cobwebs and centuries of dust. It led not to another cellar room, but to a narrow, winding tunnel, the air within smelling distinctly of salt and decay. He squeezed through, the rough-hewn walls scraping against his shoulders. The tunnel sloped downwards, the sound of distant water growing louder, a rhythmic roar that vibrated through the rock. He stood on a narrow ledge of rock, the beam of his lantern swallowed by the immensity of the space. Below him, an angry, churning sea crashed against immense, jagged formations. He was in the coastal caves, a place of immense, primeval power. The air here was thick with the scent of salt and the metallic tang of something ancient. The roar of the waves was deafening, yet through it, Marcus heard other sounds. Faint, desperate cries, the shriek of gulls, the mournful groan of straining timbers. He saw it again, not as a fleeting image, but as a full, horrifying panorama. The cavern itself seemed to replay a memory. A small wooden vessel, tossed like a toy, smashed against the rocks below. Figures, small and indistinct, were flung into the raging surf. Then the true horror unfolded. The walls of the caves, slick with spray, seemed to ripple. Faces emerged from the rock, silent, pleading, their mouths open in soundless screams. They were the lost souls, the casualties of the manor's hungry past, trapped in this watery tomb. He wasn't merely observing, he was feeling it, as if their memories were being poured directly into his own mind, overwhelming his senses, blurring his identity with theirs. His carefully constructed skepticism shattered, dissolving like sea foam on the rocks. This was no superstition, no trick of the mind. The manor was alive, a malevolent entity, and the coastal caves were its maw, regurgitating the suffering it had consumed. The unseen presence was no longer just watching. It was actively reaching, pulling, drawing him deeper into its ancient, suffocating embrace. He noted the dust motes dancing in the slender shaft of light piercing the heavy curtains. The air in the room felt thick, almost viscous, carrying a faint scent of old paper and something else, something mineral and damp, like earth disturbed after a long sleep. His reflection in the darkened window showed a man whose features had sharpened, eyes sunk deeper into their sockets, framed by hair that seemed to have lost its luster. He hadn't shaved in days. The thought of the razor, the cold water, the effort felt distant, irrelevant. A prearranged call with a colleague was scheduled for noon. He found his mobile phone where he'd left it, tucked beneath a pile of ancient blueprints he'd been attempting to decipher. The screen glowed, displaying a series of missed calls from an unknown number, then a text message from his colleague, asking if he was well, if he still planned to meet at the university library later in the week. Marcus stared at the words. The library. The thought of navigating the busy streets, the fluorescent lights, the polite academic chatter, generated a sudden, profound fatigue. He started to dial his colleague's number. The phone rang once, twice, then emitted a flat, unvarying tone before disconnecting. He tried again. The same result. He attempted to send a text, but the message failed to deliver. Perhaps the cellular network was simply unreliable in this remote location. He remembered then an appointment. He was to visit the coastal caves that afternoon, a site rumored to hold an ancient, pre-Roman etching he had been eager to examine. The prospect had once thrilled him. He walked to the window, peering out at the distant gray line of the ocean. He imagined the spray, the slick, uneven rocks, the effort of the trek. The very air around him seemed to thicken, pressing in. The outside world, with its demands and its harsh light, seemed increasingly alien, irrelevant. The caves can wait, he murmured, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. The decision, though it went against his usual methodical nature, brought with it a peculiar sense of relief, almost of comfort. He found himself drawn to the library, not to work, but to simply be there. He ran his hand over the spines of the books, the rough, dry texture of aged leather. The house seemed to breathe around him, a slow, deliberate exhalation. He felt its vastness, its ancient weight, and for the first time, a strange kinship. It was a possessiveness, not just of the house over him, but a budding possessiveness from him of the house. Days blurred into a seamless continuum. Marcus found himself increasingly disinclined to leave the manor. His research, once a meticulous, disciplined pursuit, had devolved into a form of aimless wandering, his attention drawn away from factual history towards the house's own subjective, shifting narrative. He neglected meals, subsisting on whatever he could find, often forgetting to eat altogether. His clothes, once pressed and clean, hung loosely on his frame, carrying the faint, pervasive scent of dust and damp stone. He knew, intellectually, that this was not normal. He understood that his isolation was becoming profound, his personal hygiene non-existent, his connection to the outside world severed. Yet, the knowledge carried no urgency. Instead, a strange, almost seductive lethargy had settled upon him. He was no longer just living in the house. He was becoming of it. The distinction between himself and the structure began to fray, thin as old parchment, threatening to dissolve entirely. He stared at the ceiling, the familiar plaster rosette appearing subtly altered, its intricate petals seeming to writhe. A tremor of unease, cold and precise, traced its way down his spine. He attempted to recall the exact sequence of events from the previous day, but the details blurred. Had he eaten? Had he spoken to the groundskeeper? The answers eluded him, replaced by faint, insistent images of a different era. Candlelight flickering on a different kind of desk. the rustle of heavy, unfamiliar fabrics, the distant clang of a forge. He frowned, a headache beginning to throb behind his left eye. These were not his memories. Yet, they felt undeniably present. He rose, the floorboards beneath his feet groaning with an unfamiliar timbre. He walked towards the bedroom door, his hand reaching for the cool brass knob. But the door was not there. Instead, a stretch of aged wallpaper patterned with faded hunting scenes now occupied the space where the door should have been. Marcus stared, his breath catching in his throat. He touched the wall, his fingers meeting solid, unyielding plaster. The door, a fixture for weeks, had simply vanished. A cold, analytical part of his mind insisted on logic. He must have walked into the wrong room, perhaps disoriented from sleep. But this was his bedroom. The specific orientation of the window, the placement of the antique wardrobe, all confirmed it. He turned, scanning the room again, a frantic energy beginning to churn in his gut. The wardrobe, too, seemed to have shifted, now standing flush against a wall where a window usually was. The room was the same, yet fundamentally wrong. It was as if the very geometry of the space had been subtly, maliciously reconfigured. He moved to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain. Outside, the familiar expanse of overgrown gardens lay, but the ancient oak tree, usually visible to the left, was now directly in front of him, closer, its gnarled branches scraping against the glass. The perspective was utterly alien. This was not a trick of the light, nor a lapse in his own perception. The manor was changing. A profound weariness settled over him, heavy and suffocating. Fishing nets? Marcus stopped, his hand still on the curtain. He had never owned fishing nets. Yet the thought, clear and precise, felt like his own. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples. He was Marcus. He was. He turned from the window, determined to find an exit. He circled, his footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards, searching for any seam, any hint of a hidden passage. His fingers brushed against a section of the wall near where the wardrobe now stood. There was a faint give, a subtle difference in the texture of the wallpaper. A faint, rhythmic sound, like distant thunder, resonated from within. Marcus hesitated, a primal fear urging his back. But the suffocating familiarity of the shifting room was worse. He stepped into the passage, his hand trailing along the rough, unmortared stone wall. The passage sloped downwards, the light from the bedroom fading rapidly behind him. The rhythmic sound grew louder, more defined, the unmistakable crash and retreat of ocean waves. The walls of the passage grew slick with moisture, tasting of salt on his fingertips. The air turned heavy with spray. The passage widened abruptly, opening into a vast, echoing cavern. Water surged and receded across the uneven floor, reflecting the faint, ethereal glow of bioluminescent algae clinging to the cavern walls. He was in the coastal caves. The sound of the ocean was deafening here, a powerful, ceaseless roar. He stood, drenched in spray, his mind struggling to process the impossible transition. This was not a part of the manor he had ever known, yet it felt familiar. A deep, unsettling familiarity. His gaze fell upon a cluster of barnacle-encrusted rocks near the water's edge. Wedged between them was a small, leather-bound book, its cover warped and swollen from the persistent damp. He waded through the shallow water, his boots sinking into the gritty sand, and retrieved the book. It was a journal, its pages almost fused together. He pried it open carefully, the leather creaking in protest. The ink was faded, but legible. The handwriting was not his. Yet, as his eyes scanned the words, a vivid, intrusive memory surged, not as an observer, but as the writer. The sea calls to me, the house. It pushes me to the edge. It takes my days, my thoughts, leaves me only fragments. I came to these caves for solace, for clarity, but even here the hum follows. Soon, I will be one of them." He was not merely reading. The roar of the ocean filled his ears, a mournful dirge for the man he once was, for the sanity that was now irrevocably lost. He was trapped, not just by the impossible architecture of the manor, but by the labyrinthine depths of a mind no longer his own. The words resonated with a chilling intimacy. He was the author, feeling the cold spray on his face, the desperation in his heart, the insidious erosion of his self. He was the one who had sought release. He gripped the desk, knuckles white, trying to anchor himself. Whose memories were these that flickered behind his eyes? A child's hand tracing patterns on damp sand, a woman's laugh carried on the wind, the heavy weight of a fisherman's net. None of it was his. Yet, it felt intensely, horribly familiar. A profound exhaustion settled upon him, not the weariness of a sleepless night, but a deeper, bone-deep drain. He stumbled towards the tall, arched window, needing the solidity of the outside world, but the rain-streaked glass offered only a distorted reflection. His face was paler than he remembered, the lines around his eyes etched deeper, his gaze distant. He needed to understand. The journal was the key, but it was also the conduit. Every word he absorbed, every memory he encountered within its brittle pages, seemed to displace one of his own. He tried to recall his university days, the face of his mentor, the details of his last research project. They were there, but veiled, as if seen through a thick pane of frosted glass. The past was becoming less his past, more theirs. It wasn't a thought, more a deep, resonant ache within his very being. The coastal caves. It was no longer a house, he realized with a sickening lurch, but a living, breathing thing, its walls the very membrane of an impossibly vast, insatiable organism. The path leading down from the manor grounds was overgrown, slick with mud, but he followed it without conscious thought, drawn by the invisible tether. The roar of the sea grew louder, a vast, hungry exhalation. Finally, the path opened onto a narrow, rocky beach. These were the coastal caves. The air here was thick with spray, sharp and invigorating. Yet it did nothing to dispel the profound weariness that permeated his bones. The sound of water echoing within the cavernous spaces was a mournful, endless dirge. He stepped into the largest of the caves, the light dimming instantly, swallowed by the vastness. The floor was wet shingle, slick with algae. And then he saw it. Carved crudely into the cave wall, half obscured by a veil of moss, was a symbol. It was the same symbol he'd seen faintly etched into the manor's oldest foundation stones, a complex looping design that seemed to writhe and consume itself. It represented a cycle, an intake, and an output. And the manor was the apex of this cycle. It was not merely on the land, it was the land, a construct born of some primal malevolent will, its roots burrowed deep into the earth, its tendrils reaching out to ensnare. The truth, when it came, was a crushing weight. Blackwood Manor was not merely haunted by the echoes of its past inhabitants. It was the entity. It fed. It consumed. It didn't just passively hold memories. It actively drew them in, along with the sanity, the very essence of life force, of those who dared to dwell within its walls. The journal, he now understood, was not just a record. It was a testament, a final desperate cry from a previous meal. And he, Marcus, was the current offering. He was being consumed, piece by piece, his identity dissolving, his life force slowly becoming fuel for this ancient sentient hunger. It was the manor's breath, and he was its preferred meal, slowly, meticulously being devoured. The cold spray, the desperation, the insidious erosion of self. Marcus recoiled from the precipice of that complete immersion. He was not merely reading. He was the author, yes, but a nascent, terrifying part of him screamed against the finality. Not recollection, but reabsorption. He was Marcus. He was not the mariner. He was not the historian whose meticulous notes had ended in frantic, spidery scrawl. He was not the series of forgotten souls who had walked these floors. A visceral tremor ran through him, a physical manifestation of his inner struggle. His head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache behind his eyes. But it was a familiar pain. His pain. And in that, he found a fragile anchor. The house, sensing his resistance, seemed to contract around him. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something acrid, like old copper. Shadows deepened in the corners of the study, stretching and coiling, no longer mere absences of light, but palpable presences. They pressed against the fragile barrier of his sanity, urging him to surrender, to merge, to become. No, he would not. His hands, trembling but resolute, slammed the ancient journal shut. His breath hitched, a ragged gasp. He had to fight. The house fed on memory, on sanity, on life force. It was a predator, and he, Marcus, was its prey. But he was also a historian, a seeker of truth, and somewhere within these walls, there had to be an answer, a forgotten vulnerability, a means of resistance. He moved with a frantic, desperate energy, ignoring the house's subtle attempts to deter him. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, more than usual, as if protesting his defiance. He tore through the study, rummaging through stacks of dusty tomes, pulling open drawers filled with brittle documents. His gaze darted, searching for anything out of place, anything that hinted at a countermeasure. The house, in its malevolence, had always been about absorption, about obscuring. He needed to find what it had tried to hide. A small, leather-bound volume, tucked away behind a row of larger, more imposing texts on local geology, caught his eye. It was slender, unassuming, almost identical in appearance to a dozen other diaries he had already dismissed. But something about its placement, almost deliberately concealed, spurred him. The leather felt dry, almost desiccated beneath his touch. Inside, the script was faded, but legible, written in an elegant, spidery hand that was not the mariner's, nor the historian's, but earlier still. She wrote of the hungry stones, the thirsting air. Her entries, initially clinical, grew increasingly frantic, mirroring his own descent. But then, a shift. A period of clarity, followed by a specific recurring phrase. The salt will cleanse. The deep will reclaim. Marcus's eyes scanned the pages, devouring the words. This woman, too, had fought. He had seen the house for what it was. Her later entries spoke of a locus of binding, a point of severance. She believed the house drew its primary sustenance not from the land itself, but from the sea, through a specific channel, a forgotten artery. It involved an artifact, a shard of iron from the deepest forge, and a specific location. The heart of the deep, he had written, where the sea breathes through stone. The coastal caves. He remembered the old maps, the local legends of strange currents and hidden passages beneath the cliffs. This woman, this forgotten inhabitant, had understood. The house was not merely a structure. It was a parasitic organism, rooted in the very fabric of the coast, drawing power from the relentless churn of the ocean. He clutched the book, its brittle pages threatening to crumble in his grip. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating. The house knew. It knew he had found its weakness. It knew he intended to fight. A fragile, terrifying hope ignited within him. It was a desperate gamble, a plunge into the unknown. But it was a chance. He would break its hold. A jolt, cold and sharp, had gone through Marcus. The coastal caves. The phrase resonated with a chilling clarity, an answer he hadn't known he was seeking, a truth the house had actively concealed. The house had always pulled his focus inward, towards its decaying core, away from the coast, away from any potential escape or revelation. This realization, stark and unyielding, ignited a new kind of resolve within him. He turned, a sudden, deliberate movement towards the main hall, intending to make for the heavy oak front door, a path he had neglected in his obsessive pursuit of the house's internal history. The air in the corridor shifted, growing heavy and thick, like stepping into a stagnant pool. Dust motes, previously dancing lazily in the sliver of weak light from a distant window, now swirled in agitated eddies, catching the light in a miniature frantic storm. As he reached the junction leading to the grand staircase, a blast of frigid air slammed into him, carrying the sharp metallic scent of brine, and something else. Something fetid and ancient, like earth long undisturbed. The heavy door to the drawing room, which he knew to be ajar, now stood firmly shut, its latch clicking with a final echoing snap. He heard the distinct sound of a bolt sliding home, a mechanical certainty that defied explanation. Marcus paused, his breath catching in his throat. He understood. It was fighting back. He pivoted, heading for a less used service entrance he knew led to the rear of the property, a route that would bypass the main hall's potential traps. The corridor stretched before him, familiar yet subtly altered. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern, seemed to ripple, the roses on the damask twisting into leering skeletal visages that watched him with empty eyes. Then, the floorboards ahead of him buckled. Not a slow warp, but a sudden violent heave, as if a colossal fist had punched up from beneath the earth. Marcus stumbled back, narrowly avoiding the collapse. This was no accident. The house was actively trying to consume him, to break his physical path. He turned, seeking an alternate passage, his mind racing. The house was closing in, literally. He found himself in a narrow, seldom-used servant's stairwell, the air thick with the smell of mildew and stagnant air. He began to ascend, the wooden steps groaning under his weight, each creak sounding like a lament. Midway up, a vision slammed into him. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her hands clawing at the rough-hewn stone walls. He heard her frantic, desperate whimpers, though no sound truly left her lips. Marcus gasped, stumbling against the banister, the rough wood digging into his palm. The vision vanished as abruptly as it had come, leaving him trembling, his heart hammering against his ribs. The house wasn't just blocking him. It was attempting to drown him in the suffering of its past inhabitants, to break his will, to make him believe escape was futile. He reached the landing, intending to navigate through the upper floors to a section of the house with a less fortified exit. The spectral form lashed out, not with a physical blow, but with a shockwave of frigid air that slammed into his chest, knocking the wind from his lungs. He reeled backward, stumbling over an unseen obstacle, his head striking the wall with a dull thud. His vision swam, and for a moment, the landing twisted, the ceiling pressing down, the walls seeming to breathe inward. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the house was trying to absorb him completely, to blur the lines of his reality until he was just another memory, another echo trapped within its walls. But the thought of the coastal caves, of the potential truth hidden there, remained a burning ember in the encroaching gloom. He would not. He dragged himself to his feet, his muscles aching, his head throbbing, and forced himself to continue, one painful step after another, deeper into the house's hostile embrace. The coastal caves. Now the veil was thin, almost transparent. He saw the path. His muscles, stiff from the prolonged stillness, protested as he pushed himself upright. A resolve, brittle yet unyielding, settled in his chest. This was it. The core. He gripped the heavy iron key in his palm, its cold metal a small anchor in the rising tide of unreality. The manor seemed to sense his intent. The air in the library grew heavy, thick with the scent of aged paper and something else. Something metallic and damp, like old blood on stone. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound less auditory and more visceral, a pressure against his eardrums. He felt the house's displeasure, its ancient, possessive anger. He moved through the familiar halls, now utterly alien. The grand staircase, usually a formidable ascent, seemed to stretch endlessly, the polished banister slick beneath his touch with a film of unseen moisture. Marcus felt a subtle push against his will, a quiet suggestion to turn back, to return to the relative safety of his study, to sleep. He imagined the house offering him oblivion, a gentle fading, if only he would cease his intrusion. He ignored it, focusing on the rhythmic slap of his own worn boots on the marble. They were not words, not precisely, but a cacophony of lost voices, fragments of memory, echoes of despair. He heard the faint wail of a child, the strained gasp of an old man, the brittle laughter of a young woman. These were the house's trophies, he realized, the remnants of lives consumed, now thrown at him like spears. He clamped his jaw, fighting the urge to cover his ears, to succumb to the auditory assault. His mind felt like a sieve, his own memories threatening to leak out, to mingle with the house's collection. He held onto his name, Marcus, a simple anchor. He navigated the increasingly disorienting corridors. Doors he remembered being there were gone, replaced by stretches of featureless paneling. The very architecture of the manor seemed to shift, a fluid, malicious mockery of stable reality. He was getting closer. He found it in the manor's oldest wing, a section he'd always avoided, dismissed as structurally unsound. The sound of distant rhythmic surging filled the passage, unmistakable. The ocean. This was the true threshold. He squeezed through the archway, the rough stones scraping his shoulders. This was no man-made cellar. This was a natural cavern, immense and ancient, its ceiling lost in the gloom. Water pooled on the uneven floor, reflecting the lantern's weak glow in distorted shimmers. The walls were wet, glistening, covered in strange, calcified growths that resembled grasping hands or twisted faces. And there, dominating the center of the cavern, was a gaping maw. It was an opening in the rock, leading further down to what Marcus knew instinctively were the coastal caves. But it was more than just a cave entrance. It pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence, a deep, pervasive green that seemed to absorb the light from his lantern rather than reflect it. A low, constant thrum emanated from it, resonating through his bones, vibrating in his teeth. This was the source. This was the house's true heart, its mouth, its digestive tract. He felt its hunger then, a vast, ancient emptiness that reached for him, not with physical tendrils, but with a silent, consuming pressure on his mind. It wanted his memories, his identity, his very spark of life. Marcus raised the lantern, its light trembling. He looked at the heavy, leather-bound book clutched in his other hand, its pages filled with his frantic notes, his desperate research. The iron key, still clutched in his palm, felt impossibly heavy. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the briny air burning his lungs. This was the moment. Not ever again. He raised the book, preparing to enact his plan, the true horror of the confrontation about to begin. The coastal caves. The house had always steered him away, a subtle nudge of distraction, a sudden draft, a forgotten document appearing on a different table. Now, the realization struck him like a physical blow. The house was not just on the land, it was of it. Its roots burrowed deep into the earth, perhaps even into the very bedrock of the coast. The caves were not merely geological features, they were arteries, a hidden core, a vulnerability. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards beneath his feet, a sound like a vast submerged organ beginning to play. The air in the study grew dense, viscous, pressing against his skin. The scent of dust and ancient parchment intensified, laced with something metallic and acrid, like old blood or seawater on rusted iron. He felt the house's awareness sharpen, its attention focusing on him with a terrible, possessive intensity. It knew. It always knew. He moved, not with haste, but with a deliberate, almost ritualistic purpose. He descended the main staircase, the polished wood groaning under his weight, each step echoing with an unnatural resonance. The ancestral portraits lining the walls seemed to watch him, their painted eyes following his progress, their expressions shifting subtly from serene to accusatory, then to a vacant, consuming hunger. He ignored them, focusing on the path ahead, the path the house had tried to obscure. He passed through the old wine cellars, their empty racks like skeletal ribs, then into a labyrinthine series of storage rooms he had barely explored. Here, the air grew heavy with the scent of brine and decaying algae. The floor became uneven, slick with moisture. He felt the house trying to confuse him, to disorient him. Passages he remembered as straight now seemed to curve. Doors he had opened before were inexplicably locked or led to dead ends. Yet, his new, terrible certainty guided him. Finally, a narrow, low archway presented itself, half hidden behind a stack of rotting crates. He ducked through the archway, his shoulders scraping against the damp stone. The passage sloped downwards, roughly carved, clearly not part of the manor's original, elegant design. It was older, far older. The air here was sharp with the tang of salt and decay, the wet, earthy smell of the sea. The floor was a mixture of sand and jagged stone, littered with smooth, wave-tumbled pebbles and fragments of what looked like ancient calcified wood. This was it. The sound of the ocean was immense here, a roaring, guttural presence that seemed to fill the very bones of the earth. But beneath it, another sound, constant and insidious. A soft, wet sucking, like a great unseen maw breathing slowly. He moved further into the cave, his light sweeping across the colossal space. He noticed intricate carvings on the damp rock faces, obscured by centuries of mineral deposits and marine growth. They depicted strange, geometric patterns, spirals and interlocking lines that seemed to writhe and pulse in his peripheral vision. As his light moved, they seemed to shift, to rearrange themselves. Then he saw it. In the deepest recess of the cave, where the water pooled and churned with the tide, a colossal, obsidian-like formation rose from the depths. It was not merely rock. It pulsed faintly, a deep internal luminescence, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present. It was smooth, unnaturally so, like polished glass, yet also organic, with veins and fissures that seemed to mimic root systems or neural pathways. This was the heart, the true, ancient heart of the house. It was not built upon the land. It was the land, a living, absorbing entity. The house above was merely its most elaborate, refined digestive organ. Its lure. They were not words, but fragments of sensation, echoes of fear, despair, and forgotten joy. The obsidian formation pulsed more strongly now, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very air, through his bones, through the deepest parts of his brain. He felt an irresistible pull, a terrible, seductive invitation to merge, to become one with the vast, ancient awareness that permeated the cave. He was Marcus, yes, but for how long? He saw his reflection in the polished stone, distorted, elongated, his eyes wide and vacant. It was not physical. It was a psychic jolt, a sudden, violent rejection, or perhaps a desperate embrace. A final, desperate thought clawed its way through the dissolving fog of his mind. Absorption or escape? He had found the core. He had understood. But knowledge offered no easy victory. His fingers, now pressed fully against the pulsing surface, felt a strange warmth spread through them, then deeper into his hand, his arm, his chest. He felt himself stretching, thinning, his very essence becoming porous, permeable. The boundaries of his self began to dissolve. The coastal caves hummed, absorbing.